The next theme is the most important one. Jesus. Jesus in the Psalms. In Psalms, Jesus is the predicted Messiah. The Hebrew word Mashiach, from which we derive Messiah, means anointed one. And as previously mentioned, we said that anointing in the Old Testament has to do with three kinds of leaders: kings, prophets, and priests. And they were anointed like a Messiah for their special roles. The Psalm authors point to Jesus, and that's why we could say that in one sense, all the Psalms are messianic. They're mainly of two kinds: priests and kings. Note, it's the Psalm authors, the personalities behind the Psalms. So, Asaph, Heman, and Korah were from priestly clans. David and Solomon were kings. You see how that goes there? So you have priestly influence in the Psalms, and you have monarchical influence in the Psalms. This points to the two offices in which are uniquely combined in Jesus, who is both priest and king. Back then, you had only you have a priest, then he's only a priest. You have a king, he's only king. But the great thing about Jesus is that he is both priest and king. Amen. That's a great thing for us. In your handout, there is a table with glimpses of Jesus' life. I think it's the very end. I don't know exactly where I placed it. Yeah. So glimpses of Jesus' life. So let's look at a couple of these glimpses. So the birth of Jesus is witnessed to by Psalm 104. And there's a New Testament reference there, Hebrews chapter 1. Let's look at some of the others. Praised by children. He works for God. Ministry. Betrayed by a friend. The piercing. Bones unbroken. Being accused. Hated without cause. Praying for his enemies. His death, his ascension, death, resurrection, and ascension are all there. And then you've got aspects of Jesus' nature, character, and role. For example, how he is deity and kingship in bodily form. How he is the Son of God. How he rules over his enemies. How he delights in God's will. How he is sovereign ruler. How he is zealous for God's house. We're familiar with that passage, right? Zeal for your house will consume me. That's from the Psalms. How he is priest forever, how he is chief stone of God's building, and how he comes in the name of the Lord. All of these are touched upon by the Psalms, prefigured in a way. And so the Psalms, in many ways, are forerunners of the full message of Christ when he came here on earth. Some readers will even notice glimpses of Jesus in consecutive Psalms. So a psalm has a theme, and then those themes point to Jesus. Like Psalm 22 is about suffering, someone suffering, and you could translate that to Jesus as the suffering servant. Psalm 23 points to God as a good shepherd, and that would translate to Jesus being good shepherd. And Psalm 24 on the sovereign king, and so on. So you have glimpses of Jesus all throughout the Psalter. Kidner comments on Psalm 22, no Christian can read this psalm without being vividly confronted with the crucifixion. And we did that as an exercise. We read through Psalm 22 and encircled and noted places, phrases, and words in Psalm 22 which point to Jesus' suffering. Some scholars propose that the Psalms sigh. You know, there's a sighing in longing for the Messiah, whether or not they were aware that the Messiah was the ultimate answer to their questions. So there's something we find in the Psalter. There's a certain yearning for God's rule to be felt throughout the world. There's a longing for an answer, an ultimate answer to life's questions and life's troubles. Actually, the whole Old Testament has that sense where you know that there's something better coming. And that when you read the Old Testament, you sense that there's something better in the future. There will be some fulfillment. And Jesus does say that in Matthew 5, how he fulfills what was written before him. So, in the Psalms, there is a yearning, and the focus of this aspiration is the coming Messiah. The Psalms look forward to the coming of the Messiah who will ultimately fulfill Yahweh's sovereign rule. To study this out further, I recommend a sequential study of these Psalms. You might want to do this for your quiet time. Look at these Messianic Psalms and just read them in order. You could even do this for, how many of these? Like 7. Okay, great. That's 1 week. There you go. There's a week-long quiet time. Okay? And then Psalm 118 is an example of a psalm used by a New Testament, that should be a psalm, example of a psalm used by a New Testament writer to prove that Jesus is the coming Messiah. If you see any other errors, please just let me know so we can correct them on the final PDF file. Okay, so Psalm 18 is cited by the Gospel writers. And at home, you can go ahead and study Psalm 118 and Mark 11. So, yeah. So go ahead and study that. Okay, so Psalm 110, that ends the series on Messianic Psalms. But you go ahead and read that, Psalm 110, 118, and then Mark 11. Moving on. How do we study the individual Psalms? Well, throughout the centuries, there have been different ways of studying Psalms. The most basic approach here on a personal level, an individual level, the most basic approach to Psalm study is to read the Psalter all the way through. Just read it from 1 to 150, all the way through from beginning to end. This is how people have read Psalms through the centuries. And this has benefited many Christians. They just make a goal of how many Psalms they want to read in a day. I remember Doug Jacoby one time, he felt like, bro, I just need to be more spiritual. And what Doug Jacoby did was to read all the Psalms like at least five times in a year. Like go through them in a year and just be immersed, in the Psalms. And the great thing about the Psalms is they cover such a wide spectrum of human experience. Whatever you're going through, whether you're facing pain or joy, there's just so much for you in the Psalms. For some of us, we just want to, some a nudge or some encouragement from God. Some of us, we want to get into deep theological concerns or affirmations. But all of it is encompassed in the Psalms. The continuum of human experience is found in the Psalms, and they're all there for us to study and learn from. But as far as devotional use, here are some approaches, okay? You can study the different psalm types, okay? Start with laments, and then possibly go to, or maybe praise and laments and thanksgiving. You could do that. Or since laments occur most frequently, you could start with laments too. It's up to you. You study out the collections. So you study the Davidic collections. Maybe another week, the Korahite Psalms, Asaph Psalms. Study the Davidic Psalms as these relate to segments in David's life. That's a good one as well. So you read the Psalms in the order of David's life. Okay? So you would tie in, let's say, his running away from his son with the Psalms that talk about him, dealing with enemies, and then his sin with Bathsheba. Connect that with the appropriate psalm. That's another way to do it. And then you can also do word studies. We talked about different themes in the Psalms. You can find different word studies on the internet, and there's also books that focus on just word studies from different books of the Bible. So there are books that focus on word studies in the wisdom books, wisdom literature, and then there are books that will talk about word studies or thematic studies in Psalms. Well, for an individual psalm to be studied, I recommend this analogy. The analogy is appreciating art. Studying a psalm is like appreciating a painting. And I would put forward 3 steps and guide questions for working through the text. So, how do you look at a painting? Okay, I'm not an expert in art, but I do know that once you see a painting, right, there's an initial impression you have. Okay, you get an initial impression. You look at it as a whole. There's a first impression, and then you look closer to observe the details of how the painter came up with his work, different brush strokes, techniques, you notice those, and then you step back to appreciate the painting as a whole and how it impacts you. So those would be the 3 steps. Step 1, because the Psalms are works of art, get oriented. Overall, what do you see in this psalm? What type of psalm is it? Can you categorize it? Will it fit into just one category or 2? Because we know some psalms defy strict categorizing. So, what type of psalm is it? If the psalm has a title, what can I learn from it? Because sometimes the titles are helpful. And does this psalm have links to the one before or after it? In your handout, I placed there a table derived from Fee and Stewart of how they link psalms. Remember how psalms have relationships, linkages, sometimes thematic, sometimes textual. They have links to the psalms before and after. Okay, and that's why we have collections. So, does this psalm have links to the one before or after it? Is it paired with another psalm? Like Psalm 9 would definitely be paired with Psalm 106. If you're studying Psalm 105, might as well study Psalm 106. If you're studying one of the kingship psalms in the series 93 to 99, then might as well read all of them, right, to get a better feel of what kingship is in that series. Is this making sense? All right, so the collections are crucial. So think about, in a larger scale, does this psalm have links to the ones before or after it? Next is to get into more detail. Step into the psalm, get into the poetry. And this is where you look at the parts of the psalm. We looked at the parts of a lament, the parts of a praise psalm, and then the parts of a todah, or a thanksgiving psalm. So you break it down into different parts. You notice how different passages contribute to the overall thrust of the psalm. But the portions, sometimes they're easily discernible, sometimes not. Anyway, what are the questions to ask? What are the form and flow of the text? Form has to do with the different parts of the psalm. Like we said, there's an invocation for a lament. There's a recall for a thanksgiving. So these are parts, and you could find them in the various strophes. Okay? The flow of the text. How does the psalmist go from one strophe to the next? What are the connections? Sometimes you'll notice there are words like therefore, which lead to the next strophe. Sometimes you'll encounter the word but, right? So that you know that there's transition from one theme or one topic to another. What images are used? The poets use a lot of imagery to convey their message. So you want to look at the metaphors. You want to look at the similes. How does the psalmist use those? You could add also here parallelism. So parallelism is used to drive the message, even parallelism within a verse, and sometimes there's parallelism between verses. Number 3, get the message. So you step back and you look at the psalm as a whole. What big theme is touched upon in this psalm? You also ask what might be the author's situation and feelings in this psalm, and how would this psalm apply to me? Okay, here's something to do for homework. Okay, for homework, take some time to read through Psalm 138 3 times. I had mentioned this. There is no substitute for reading and rereading the text. Okay? Read the text first before you consult the experts. And read the text in your favorite translation as well as other translations. For those of you who are taking this via distance, you can go ahead and do this now. Read the psalm multiple times and then try working on the 3 steps while asking yourselves the questions. Okay, we won't go through Psalm 5 in detail, but I chose Psalm 5, the 5th Psalm, to... did we read this yesterday or no? Probably not, huh? Okay, let's go ahead and just read Psalm 5, okay? Let's go ahead and read Psalm 5. Oh, I'm using the English numbering, so I'll read it from the NIV. I'll read from the... Okay, let's turn our Bibles to Psalm 5. Listen to my words, Lord. Consider my lament. Hear my cry for help, my King and my God, for to you I pray. In the morning, Lord, you hear my voice. In the morning I lay my request before you and wait expectantly. For you are not a God who is pleased with wickedness. With you, evil people are not welcome. The arrogant cannot stand in your presence. You hate all who do wrong. You destroy You destroy those who tell lies. The bloodthirsty and deceitful, you, Lord, detest. But I, by your great love, can come into your house. In reverence, I bow down toward your holy temple. Lead me, Lord, in your righteousness. Because of my enemies, make your way straight before me. Not a word from their mouth can be trusted. Their heart is filled with malice. Their throat is an open grave. With their tongues they tell lies. Declare them guilty, O God. Let their intrigues be their downfall. Banish them for their many sins, for they have rebelled against you. But let all who take refuge in you be glad. Let them ever sing for joy. Spread your protection over them, that those who love your name may rejoice in you. Surely, Lord, you bless the righteous. You surround them with your favor as with a shield. Okay, step 1. What category of psalm is it? This is an individual lament. That's clear from the first 3 verses. He even uses the word lament. He's crying, he's praying. Those are indicative of a lament. The introduction is meant to call attention to the psalmist's suffering. However, it extends itself to include the community later on. But primarily, this is an individual lament. And as I mentioned earlier, several laments carry this feature of looking outward. So, category, lament. Subcategory, individual lament. Does this psalm have links to the ones before or after it? The psalm reads like other laments adjacent to it, and you will find parallels in Psalms 3 to 7. Actually, you can even go until Psalm 11. Those are all laments. And for that series, you'll find a lot about David's opposers. Okay, a lot of opposition in those psalms. So this series pleads for God's justice and deliverance, and Psalm 5, interestingly, is at the center of this group, and it helps to consider how the whole series might shed light on Psalm 5. If you do that, read the whole series, you'll find some common strands. They all bank on God's commitment on the righteous, okay? That God will bless the righteous eventually. If you stay godly, then God will bless you, all right? And 2, they all end on a very positive and confident note. So there's that grouping right there. Psalm 5 is a part of a group, and the linkage is that series from Psalm 3 to Psalm 7. Also, in step 2, you want to look at the flow. And so you find, for me, and you might have your own division, okay? But for me, I find 5 strophes. So in the NIV, the first strophe is verse 1 and 2. Okay? If your Bible has those indentations and space between strophes, you'll find that the translators of the NIV will put a space between verses 2 and 3 to say that the first strophe is verse 1 and 2, and then the next strophe starts in verse 3. But for me, I think the first strophe is verses 1 through 2, 3. Again, if you have different Bibles, well, they'll put strophes in different ways. So the publishers will allow that. Okay, different ways of dividing up the psalm. Okay, so here I find when I worked on Psalm 5, I found 5 strophes. Plea to God, verses 1 through 3. Perception of God, verse 4 through 6. Prayer of confidence, verse 7 to 8. Punishment of evildoers, 9 to 10. Praise to God, verse 11 12. I kind of think like an evangelist, so when I study Psalms, so it's a sermon ready, if you will. So yeah, that's my working outline. Okay, so fortunately, it's ready to preach, but many times it's not this clean. Okay. Nonetheless, let's go ahead and look at some of the other things for step 2. What images are used? David makes use of good imagery in this psalm. He describes God, and he describes the wicked. And also, you'll notice there's a contrast between him and the wicked as he identifies himself on God's side. Okay, some of the images are, verse 3, I lay my requests. This could be a picture of someone going forward to the temple and making an offering. That's a possibility. Or it could also be the picture of a servant, a vassal, coming into the throne room, humbly bowing before a king. Okay, laying his request before the king. Verse 7 has the scene of entering the temple. Verse 8 has Yahweh as leader and guide. So, a picture of God there. And then verse 11, 12, Yahweh as protector. Okay, so here are some of the words, phrases that are used. And then, like I said, he also describes the wicked. Okay, heart filled with malice, verse 9. Ooh, man, heart filled with malice. Their throat is an open grave. With their tongues they tell lies. Okay, let their intrigues be their downfall. So lots of pictures, lots of word pictures there. Okay, so much for images. Now let's look to the big theme. We're stepping back now, and we're looking at the psalm as a whole. So what big theme is touched upon in this psalm? The text reveals an atmosphere of opposition. The psalmist is afflicted, yet he believes that God will change his situation and ensure justice. So the big theme of the psalm is God's vindication of his people. Others may word this differently, but this is how I would word it. So, how would then this apply to me? Psalm 5 harps on the tough times in life. Here's opposition, that's there, affliction, and discouragement. And like I said, the Psalms are vague in this sense, but the vagueness helps us to apply our own lives, right? To connect our lives to the psalmist's life, what he's experiencing. Opposition, affliction, discouragement. And we all experience these. So we can relate to the psalmist's cry for help. And we can also learn from his relationship with God. So if I were to distill it, my learnings, this is what I would take away. We can pray honestly and humbly. We can pray with pointed expectation, and we can remain righteous in affliction. Okay? You see how I went from my poem outline to my takeaway outline, right? Okay? So this is my takeaway. We, or I, can pray honestly and humbly. I can pray with expectation, I can remain righteous in affliction. So, I can pray honestly and humbly. And maybe if I do decide to preach this, or maybe I write it down further in my quiet time, David here is determined to bring his case to Yahweh. He repeats himself. He implores the Lord in plain but very persuasive terms. And I think that's a good thing for us in prayer. We would do well to pray like David did. And then he also has expectation. He's obviously going through a bad patch, yet he expresses hope. And that's the thing we love about the psalmists. They express hope in the midst of despair. So, there is an against all odds type of expectation in the Psalms, and that is worth emulating. He lays his request before God because he knows that God will answer. And the third one has to do with our reaction to affliction. How do we react? Are we quick to retaliate? David, in this prayer, reminds himself of God's character while he prayed. You are not a God who is pleased with wickedness. I like that, verse 4. Therefore, we can expect vindication. So David is David in the inner workings of his mind is telling himself, I will not exact revenge for myself. I will be self-controlled. I will be forbearing. I will focus on God's promises. I will focus on God's character. And I will be assured that God will move on my behalf. Okay? So, I hope that was helpful. We looked at Psalm 5, a first impression, a closer look, breaking down the psalm, and then stepping back for an overall perspective and looking at how the psalm can impact us.